California, Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put my written statement into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, Mr. Chairman, we generally pass the threshold question when we have witnesses appearing before us, that threshold question being the credibility and the credentials of the witnesses. But I think it would be interesting to General Petraeus to know, and perhaps he does know, and Ambassador Crocker to some degree, that the last week or so has been spent attacking your credibility with major attacks here in the United States, some of them emanating from right here, saying essentially that your testimony today is going to be, and I quote my friend from California, Mr. Lantos, not your testimony, but testimony which is written by, quote, political operatives. In fact, I know that's not the case. I haven't reviewed your testimony, but I know this: duty, honor, country. Those are the principles by which our great officers in the United States Army and the other services derive their careers and base their careers on. We've asked you for an independent assessment. And frankly, Mr. Chairman, the idea that we have spent the last week prepping the battlefield by attacking the credibility of the messenger is something that I think goes against the tradition of this great House. And the last thing that I saw that particularly irritated me was a massive full-page ad in, I think it was the New York Times, stating that General Petraeus is, in fact, General Betray Us. That's moveon.org. Mr. Chairman, one of the great assets of this country is the professionalism and the capability and the integrity of the people who lead our armed forces. General Petraeus is coming back not just as a guy who's going to give us his take on the Iraq situation, but as the leader of more than 160,000 American personnel in uniform in Iraq. And they're not only watching his testimony, but they're also watching our testimony. They're watching how we treat him. They're watching this Congress to see if we give credibility to what people in uniform say. And so, Mr. Chairman, I think it's an outrage that we've spent the last week prepping the ground, bashing the credibility of a general officer whose trademark is integrity, who was unanimously supported by the U.S. Senate for his position, and unanimity in the U.S. Senate is almost a majority these days. And also Mr. Crocker, who brings an outstanding, unblemished record in the United States State Department to this very difficult position. Now, you know, I haven't read General Petraeus' report, but I do know some of the facts. I know the fact that we had 1,350 attacks in Anbar province last October, that is down by 80%. Now, my friend Mr. Lantos has pointed out that Anbar is about 5% of the population. I'd say to my friend that's true. But at times in this war, it has been 50% of the American casualties. And therefore, what happens in Anbar province is of importance to Americans, and not just to the general public, but to the mothers and fathers and to the service people themselves who serve in that very difficult theater. Now, in my estimation, the stand-up of the Iraqi military is a key to a stabilized Iraq. And that means those 131 battalions that we have trained and equipped. And for those who said that we could have kept Saddam Hussein's army in place and that was somehow a major blunder, I'm reminded that Saddam Hussein's army had 11,000 Sunni generals. Now, what are you going to do with an army with 11,000 Sunni generals? Literally squads of generals, many of whom have made their careers beating up on a Shiite population, when that army is supposed to be the honest broker that brings reconciliation to the communities in Iraq. And you know something? If you look at the leadership of the Iraqi army now, as shaped by General Petraeus and his subordinates, you now see Shiites in leadership positions. You see Sunnis in leadership positions. You see Kurds in leadership positions. You see a military which is starting to emerge as a professional force. And for those who say that we could have simply adopted Saddam Hussein's army and that would have been the, quote, smooth road, there is absolutely no precedent for that. So, Mr. Chairman, I've been here before. I was here when the left in this body said that if we stood up to the Russians in Central Europe, we would bring on another war, that President Ronald Reagan was going to bring on World War III. Instead, we held tough, we stood tough, and we brought down the Berlin Wall. And I was here when, in Central America, when we had the communists supplying the FMLN, and we put a small protection around that fragile government, and we allowed them to have free and fair elections. I remember people in this body saying that would be our next Vietnam. We would be bogged down. Well, we hung tough. We provided that shield, and today there's El Salvadorans standing with American forces in Iraq. Now, the key to having a stabilized Iraq, which is a friend, not an enemy of the United States, which will not be a state sponsor of terrorism for the next 5 to 10 to 15 to 20 years, in my estimation, is a successful handoff of the security apparatus from American forces to the Iraqi armed forces. And that requires one thing. It requires reliability. Having a reliable Iraqi force, and that is manifest in those 131 battalions that are now maturing. And the idea that this Congress is going to arbitrarily overlay a requirement for a reduction in America's forces when we are moving toward a maturing of the Iraqi forces and a successful handoff, which will be a victory for the United States, I think should not be supported by this body. So, Mr. Chairman, let's lead off this hearing with this stipulation, that the gentlemen who are appearing before us, and particularly General Petraeus, whose credibility has been attacked all week long by the left in this country, represents the very best in military tradition, that he's going to testify with an independent, candid view, and he's going to give us the one thing we ask of all of our military officers, and that's a candid, independent assessment given with integrity in the same tradition of MacArthur and Eisenhower and Schwarzenegger.